The morning sun painted golden streaks across Memorial Park as Thomas Wilson, a 68-year-old retired history teacher, settled onto his usual wooden bench. It was just another Tuesday morning, or at least, that's how it seemed at first. The spring air carried the sweet scent of blooming cherry blossoms, mixing with the earthy aroma of fresh-cut grass that the park maintenance crew had trimmed earlier. Thomas wasn't just any regular visitor. For the past 10 years, rain or shine, he'd made this park his morning sanctuary. The locals knew him well. He was the kind-faced gentleman who always carried a bag of bird feed in one pocket and his trusty old copy of To Kill a Mockingbird in the other. The book's spine was cracked, its pages dog-eared from countless readings, but to Thomas it remained as relevant today as when he first taught it to his students decades ago. On this particular morning, he watched as a pair of cardinals hopped closer, their bright red feathers standing out against the fresh spring grass. He reached into his brown paper bag, scattering a handful of seeds in front of his bench. The ritual brought a gentle smile to his weathered face, deepening the laugh lines around his eyes that spoke of a life well lived. A group of young mothers with strollers passed by, waving warmly. "Good morning, Mr. Wilson," they called out. He taught some of their parents years ago at the local high school. Thomas lifted his hand in a friendly wave, his silver-rimmed glasses catching the morning light. He'd retired from teaching 5 years ago, but his passion for education never faded. Sometimes he'd share stories with curious kids who stopped by his bench, telling them about historical events that shaped their town. The park was coming to life around him. Early morning joggers traced the winding paths, their shoes crunching against the gravel. A couple of elderly women power-walked past, deep in conversation about their grandchildren. Near the playground, a father pushed his toddler on the swings, the child's delighted giggles carrying across the morning air. Thomas opened his book, finding his place marked by an old photograph he used as a bookmark. It showed his late wife and him at this very park, 20 years younger, both smiling at the camera during a community picnic. The memory warmed his heart as he settled in to read, occasionally glancing up to watch the birds or greet another familiar face. His neat appearance reflected his former profession, pressed khaki slacks, a light blue button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up against the warming day, and well-polished brown loafers. A park permit was clearly visible on the bench beside him, something he always made sure to display after the park implemented new rules last summer. The morning had been peaceful, just like hundreds of others before it. Children's laughter echoed from the playground, mixing with the chirping of sparrows and cicadas that had gathered around his feet. Thomas took a sip from his thermos of green tea, savoring the tranquility of his morning routine. He had no way of knowing that this ordinary Tuesday was about to become anything but ordinary. As the clock ticked closer to 9:30 a.m., the peaceful scene he'd grown so accustomed to was about to be shattered. The next few moments would not only change his life, but would spark a conversation that would ripple through the entire community. What happened next would test his dignity, courage, and the very principles he taught his students about for over 3 decades. But for now, in these last peaceful moments, Thomas Wilson simply sat on his bench, feeding the birds, completely unaware that he was about to become the center of a story that would shake their quiet town to its core. The peaceful morning shattered when Officer Richard Bennett's patrol car pulled up along the park's curb. He'd been with the force for 15 years, and during that time, his record spoke volumes. Though not in the way a police officer's record should. There were multiple complaints filed against him, all carefully documented but somehow never leading to serious consequences. Most of these complaints shared a troubling pattern that the department had repeatedly overlooked. Bennett stepped out of his vehicle, adjusting his belt with a practiced motion. His boots crunched against the gravel path as he surveyed the park like he owned it. Something about the way he carried himself made even the morning birds scatter, leaving behind only the scattered seeds on the ground near Thomas's bench. The officer's approach wasn't the casual stroll of someone checking in on their community. Each step was deliberate, his face set in what seemed like a permanent scowl. A young mother who had been heading toward the playground suddenly changed direction, pulling her toddler closer as she sensed the tension in the air. Even the morning joggers began taking different paths, their instincts telling them something wasn't right. "Hey you!" Bennett called out, his voice carrying an edge that cut through the morning calm. He was still 20 feet away from Thomas's bench, but his tone had already drawn attention from nearby parkgoers. "What's your business here?" Thomas looked up from his book, his expression calm but cautious. He'd been through similar situations before, not just personally, but he'd seen it happen to others too many times. His years of teaching had taught him how to handle tense situations with dignity. "Good morning, officer," he responded, his voice steady and clear. "I'm just enjoying my morning reading, as I do every Tuesday." Bennett moved closer, his hand resting unnecessarily on his belt. "This is an upscale neighborhood park," he said, emphasizing each word like they were accusations. "We've had reports of suspicious activity." Of course, there hadn't been any such reports, at least none that were legitimate. The only suspicious activity in Memorial Park lately had been kids trying to sneak their skateboards onto the walking paths after hours. Thomas carefully placed his bookmark between the pages of his book, setting it down beside the clearly visible park permit. "Officer, I've been coming to this park for over 10 years now. Many people here know me. I taught at the high school for 30 years. But Bennett wasn't interested in explanations. His eyes narrowed as they darted from Thomas to the bench, to the scattered bird feed on the ground. "Let me see some ID, he demanded, despite having no probable cause. "And what's in that bag?" He gestured toward the simple brown paper bag that held nothing more threatening than birdseed. The morning had grown unusually quiet. The children's laughter from the playground had died down. The regular park visitors who knew Thomas had stopped their activities, watching the scene unfold with growing concern. A few had already pulled out their phones, their expressions a mix of worry and disbelief. "Officer," Thomas began again, his voice still calm though his heart was racing. "I have my ID, but I'd like to know what violation you suspect me of committing." His years of teaching had included lessons on civil rights, and he knew them well, both from the textbooks and from life experience. Bennett's face flushed red at the question. "Listen here," he snapped, taking another step closer. "When an officer asks for ID, you don't ask questions. You comply." His voice had risen enough that it carried across the park, drawing more attention. A group of morning walkers had stopped their routine, watching with growing concern. Thomas slowly reached for his wallet, his movements deliberate and careful. The park permit lay right there on the bench, ignored by Bennett despite being the very thing that authorized Thomas's presence. The morning sun caught the badge on Bennett's chest, creating a glare that seemed to highlight the irony of the situation, an officer sworn to protect and serve, doing neither. What neither of them knew was that this interaction wasn't going unnoticed. Just beyond the line of oak trees that bordered the walking path, someone was watching. Someone whose presence would soon turn this unfortunate situation into a powerful catalyst for change. The next few moments would test not just Thomas's dignity, but the very foundations of justice in their community. Behind the line of oak trees, District Attorney Linda Thompson was taking her usual morning jog when she first noticed the scene unfolding. She'd only been in office for 3 months, having won the election on a platform of police accountability and community justice. Her campaign promises weren't just political talking points. They came from 20 years of working in civil rights law and seeing firsthand how power could be misused. Linda slowed her pace, her running shoes silent against the path's newly laid wood chips. She'd chosen this park for her morning runs because it represented everything she loved about their community: peaceful, welcoming, and diverse. But what she was witnessing now made her blood run cold. As she watched Officer Bennett's aggressive stance and heard his confrontational tone, her legal mind kicked into high gear. She pulled her phone from her running belt, making sure her hands didn't shake as she opened the camera app. Years of courtroom experience had taught her the importance of documenting everything, and this situation was setting off every warning bell in her head. The morning sun filtered through the trees, creating perfect lighting conditions for recording. Linda positioned herself carefully, making sure to capture both the officer's badge number and the larger scene. She noticed other park visitors doing the same thing. At least 3 people had their phones out, recording from different angles. This wasn't just about capturing evidence anymore. It was about everyday citizens standing up for what was right. From her position, she could clearly see Thomas's park permit lying ignored on the bench. She could also see his calm demeanor despite the officer's increasingly aggressive behavior. As a DA, she'd reviewed hundreds of police conduct cases, But watching one unfold in real time was different. Every detail registered in her mind. The time, 9:47 a.m. according to her phone, the weather conditions, clear and sunny, the number of witnesses growing by the minute. A young couple walking their golden retriever had stopped nearby, the wife discreetly filming while the husband called what appeared to be the police department's non-emergency number. Linda could hear him speaking quietly but firmly. "Yes, I'd like to report a concerning interaction between an officer and an elderly gentleman at Memorial Park." The morning joggers who usually passed through quickly were now finding reasons to slow down or stop completely. A group of regular parkgoers who clearly recognized Thomas had gathered at a respectful distance. Their faces showed a mix of concern and determination. These weren't just passive bystanders, but engaged citizens ready to step in if needed. Linda's mind raced through the legal implications of what she was witnessing. As district attorney, she had the power to act, but timing was crucial. Intervene too early, and Bennett might be able to claim he was just doing his job. Wait too long, and the situation could escalate dangerously. She needed to document enough to show a clear pattern of harassment while ensuring everyone's safety. The breeze carried snippets of conversation across the park. She could hear Thomas's steady voice explaining his routine, his rights, his history with the park. In contrast, Bennett's responses grew increasingly agitated, his authority challenged not by defiance but by simple dignity. Every word, every gesture was being captured not just on Linda's phone, but on the phones of at least half a dozen concerned citizens. What struck her most was the community's response. This wasn't just about one officer and one man anymore. It was about a community silently coming together, forming an invisible network of protection and witness. A retired nurse had positioned herself closer to Thomas's bench, pretending to read her morning paper. Two construction workers on their coffee break had paused their conversation, their hard hats visible from Linda's position, ready to serve as additional witnesses. The morning light continued to strengthen, and with it, the tension in the air grew thicker. Linda's finger stayed steady on the record button as she watched Officer Bennett's hand move toward his belt again. The next few moments would require perfect timing and careful intervention. As district attorney, she knew her words would carry weight, but first she needed to document just a little more, gather just a little more evidence. She shifted her position slightly, making sure to capture a clear angle of both Thomas's calm compliance and Bennett's escalating aggression. The oak trees provided perfect cover while allowing her an unobstructed view of what was about to become one of the most significant moments in their community's recent history. The morning air grew heavy with tension as Officer Bennett's patience visibly wore thin. Thomas had just finished carefully removing his wallet from his back pocket, his movements deliberately slow and clear. His years of teaching experience had taught him how to maintain composure in difficult situations, but this was testing every ounce of his self-control. "I said hurry up." Bennett's voice cracked through the air like a whip, causing nearby birds to scatter from their perches. The officer's hand still rested on his belt, his fingers drumming against the leather in an agitated rhythm. The morning sun caught his badge, number 4479, glinting as his chest heaved with poorly contained anger. Thomas kept his movements measured and calm. "Officer, I'm following your instructions," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor he felt in his hands. "My ID is right here." He held out his driver's license, careful to keep his other hand visible and still on his lap. But before Thomas could properly hand over his identification, Bennett stepped forward aggressively. "Stand up," he barked, reaching for Thomas's arm. The sudden movement caused Thomas's beloved copy of To Kill a Mockingbird to tumble from the bench, landing spine up in the scattered birdseed. A collective gasp rose from the gathering crowd. The retired nurse who had been pretending to read her paper took an instinctive step forward. "He doesn't need to stand," she called out, her voice shaking but determined. "He's done nothing wrong." Bennett's head snapped toward the voice. "Stay back. This is police business." His grip on Thomas's arm tightened, causing the elderly man to wince visibly. The park permit fluttered to the ground, joining the book in the dirt. The construction workers on their break had moved closer, their orange safety vests bright in the morning sun. One pulled out his phone, joining the growing number of people recording the incident. "Hey, take it easy," he called out, his voice carrying the weight of someone used to managing dangerous situations. "That's no way to treat anyone, let alone an elder." Thomas remained dignified despite the officer's rough handling. His pressed shirt was becoming wrinkled where Bennett gripped his arm, but his voice remained calm. "Officer, you're hurting me," he stated clearly, making sure his words would be picked up by the various recording devices around them. "I've shown no resistance and I'm trying to comply with your requests." The young couple with the golden retriever had moved closer, their dog sensing the tension and staying unusually quiet. The wife was still filming while her husband spoke quietly but urgently into his phone. "Yes, we need a supervisor at Memorial Park immediately. An officer is using excessive force on an elderly gentleman. Multiple witnesses present." Bennett's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "I said stay under you, Pep," he shouted, yanking Thomas's arm harder. The elderly man's glasses slipped down his nose from the sudden movement, but he managed to catch them with his free hand. A child's voice piped up from somewhere in the crowd. "Mom, why is that police officer being mean to Mr. Wilson?" The innocent question seemed to hang in the air, making the situation even more stark in its injustice. Thomas slowly rose to his feet, his dignity intact despite the rough treatment. His legs shook slightly, not from fear, but from the physical strain of being handled so roughly. Still, he kept his eyes level, his voice clear. "Officer Bennett," he said, emphasizing the name he'd read on the badge, "I want to be clear that I'm cooperating under protest. Your actions are unnecessary and, I believe, unlawful." The crowd had grown larger now, forming a loose circle around the scene. Phones recorded from every angle, capturing each moment of the escalating situation. The morning sun cast long shadows across the park, creating an almost theatrical scene of light and darkness. More park regulars had arrived for their usual morning routines, only to find themselves witness to this unfolding drama. A group of power walkers had stopped their exercise, their faces showing a mix of shock and determination. One of them, a former legal secretary, was carefully noting down the time and details of everything she observed. The tension in the air was almost physical now, like the heaviness before a storm. Everyone could sense that this situation was balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong move, one more aggressive action from Bennett, and things could spiral out of control. Yet through it all, Thomas maintained his composure, his years of teaching history and civil rights now playing out in real life. He stood straight despite the pain in his arm, his eyes scanning the crowd, acknowledging the support of his community without saying a word. In that moment, he wasn't just standing for himself, he was standing for every person who had ever faced similar injustice in silence. Just as Officer Bennett's grip tightened further on Thomas's arm, a clear, authoritative voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "Officer Bennett." The voice rang out across the park, causing everyone to turn toward its source. "I am District Attorney Linda Thompson, and I'm ordering you to release Mr. Wilson immediately." Linda emerged from behind the oak trees, her phone still recording, her running clothes lending a surprising contrast to her commanding presence. She walked forward with purpose, each step measured and confident. The morning sun caught the light sheen of sweat on her face, evidence of her interrupted morning run, but her expression was as composed as if she was standing in a courtroom. Bennett's face cycled through a range of emotions, shock, anger, and then something that looked like fear. His grip on Thomas's arm loosened slightly, but he didn't let go completely. "This is a police matter, ma'am," he said, trying to maintain his authority despite the tremor in his voice. "No, Officer Bennett," Linda replied, continuing her steady approach. "This is now a matter of civil rights violation under color of authority, occurring in front of multiple witnesses, including the district attorney of this county." She held up her phone, making it clear she had been recording. "I have the entire interaction documented, from your unauthorized demand for identification to your use of excessive force on a senior citizen who was clearly complying with all legal requests." The crowd had grown silent, phones still recording, as they watched the scene unfold. The golden retriever from earlier let out a small whine, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Its owner gently hushed it, not wanting to miss a single word. "I've been watching this entire interaction," Linda continued, her voice carrying across the now silent park. "Mr. Wilson displayed his park permit, which you ignored. He attempted to provide identification, which you didn't wait to receive. He stated clearly that you were hurting him, which you chose to disregard. Would you like me to continue listing the violations I've witnessed? Bennett's face had gone from red to pale. His hand finally dropped from Thomas's arm, leaving behind a visible wrinkle in the once crisp sleeve. Thomas took a small step back, rubbing his arm gently but maintaining his dignified posture. Linda turned to address the crowd, her voice clear and professional. Would those of you who have been recording please stay for a few minutes? We'll need to collect your contact information and footage as evidence. Several people nodded eagerly, including the construction workers in their bright vests and a retired nurse who had spoken up earlier. The former legal secretary who had been taking notes stepped forward. I've documented everything, Mrs. Thompson, she said, holding up her notepad. Times, actions, exact words used, just like you taught us in that community legal rights workshop last month. Linda nodded appreciatively, then turned back to Officer Bennett. Your body camera is on, correct? She asked, though it wasn't really a question. Bennett's hand instinctively went to the device on his chest. Good. That footage will be particularly interesting to review alongside these civilian recordings. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting away the last shadows from the trees. A gentle breeze lifted a few pages of Thomas's fallen book, still lying in the scattered birdseed. One of the construction workers carefully picked it up, dusting it off before handing it back to Thomas with a respectful nod. Officer Bennett, Linda continued, her voice taking on an official tone, I am instructing you to return to your vehicle and call your supervisor to the scene. You will remain there until they arrive. She turned to Thomas, her voice softening slightly. Mr. Wilson, would you be willing to provide a statement? What happened here today needs to be properly documented. Thomas straightened his glasses, which had remained slightly askew during the confrontation. Yes, of course, he replied, his voice still steady. I believe it's important to ensure this doesn't happen to anyone else. The crowd began to murmur in approval. The young mother who had asked about the mean police officer earlier was now explaining quietly to her child how brave people stand up for what's right. The regular parkgoers had formed a protective semicircle around Thomas, their presence a clear statement of community solidarity. Linda pulled out her business card and handed it to Thomas. We'll need to take photos of any marks on your arm, she said professionally, then added with genuine concern, and please get checked out by a medical professional. I want documentation of any injuries, no matter how minor they might seem. As Bennett retreated to his patrol car, the atmosphere in the park began to shift. The tension was still there, but it was different now, like storm clouds beginning to clear. People were stepping forward one by one, offering their names and contact information, ready to stand as witnesses. The morning had started with one man being targeted for simply existing in a public space, but it was transforming into a powerful demonstration of community unity and justice in action. Within hours of the incident, Memorial Park became the epicenter of a story that would shake the entire community. News vans lined the peaceful streets where joggers had run just that morning, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal sunflowers. The park's usual tranquility had been replaced by a buzz of activity, but this time it was the sound of justice in motion. Police Chief Robert Anderson called an emergency press conference right there in the park, choosing to address the situation where it had occurred rather than hide behind the formal walls of the police station. The afternoon sun cast long shadows behind the portable podium as he stepped up to speak, his face grave with the weight of the moment. What happened in this park today is unacceptable, the chief began, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. Officer Bennett has been placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. He paused, looking directly into the cameras. But more than that, we recognize that this incident represents a deeper issue that must be addressed. The crowd that had gathered was a testament to how quickly news could spread in the age of social media. The videos taken by witnesses had already begun circulating online, drawing attention from civil rights organizations and news outlets across the country. But what made this story different was how the community had come together. Thomas sat in a comfortable chair provided by the park staff, an ice pack on his arm where Bennett's grip had left visible marks. The retired nurse who had spoken up earlier had insisted on checking him over, her years of medical experience evident in her gentle but thorough examination. The bruising is minor, she explained to the paramedics who arrived later, but it's the principle that matters. District Attorney Linda Thompson stood nearby, her running clothes now covered by a blazer brought by her assistant. She was speaking with a group of reporters, her words measured but firm. This isn't just about one incident, she explained. It's about ensuring that every member of our community feels safe in our public spaces. The quick response of citizens who recorded this incident, who spoke up, who stayed to give statements, that's what community policing should look like. The construction workers who had witnessed everything had taken their lunch break to provide detailed statements. We work all over town, one of them told a reporter, his orange safety vest bright against the afternoon sky. We see how different people get treated different ways. But today, we saw how things can change when people stand together. Inside the police station, the Internal Affairs Department was already reviewing the footage, not just from the civilian recordings and Bennett's body camera, but also from the park's security cameras. The evidence was overwhelming, painting a clear picture of abuse of authority and racial profiling. What surprised many was the number of people who came forward with similar stories. The incident had opened a floodgate of experiences that had gone unreported, each person feeling empowered by Thomas's dignity and the community's response. The former legal secretary who had taken such detailed notes was now helping others document their past encounters, creating a pattern that could no longer be ignored. The young mother whose child had asked about the mean police officer turned the moment into a teaching opportunity. She organized a community picnic right there in the park, encouraging families to come together and talk about what they had witnessed or experienced. Our children need to see that standing up for what's right can make a difference, she explained to a local reporter. Thomas's story was becoming a catalyst for change, but he remained humble throughout. When asked about pressing charges, he spoke with the same thoughtful clarity he had used in his classroom for 30 years. This isn't about revenge, he told the reporters. It's about accountability and ensuring that our community learns and grows from this experience. The police chief's press conference continued with unprecedented announcements. Effective immediately, we will be implementing new training programs, he declared. But more importantly, we're establishing a civilian oversight committee to review police conduct. We're asking community members to be part of the solution. As the afternoon wore on, more people arrived at the park, many bringing flowers or simply coming to show support. The bench where Thomas had sat peacefully that morning became a symbol of both injustice and hope, injustice in what had occurred, but hope in how the community had responded. Social media was ablaze with the story, but what caught people's attention wasn't just the confrontation, it was the aftermath. It was the construction workers sharing their sandwich lunch with Thomas as they waited to give statements. It was the retired nurse organizing a schedule of people to accompany seniors during their park visits. It was the former students of Thomas who showed up with their own copies of To Kill a Mockingbird, creating an impromptu reading circle on the grass. 1 month after the incident at Memorial Park, the changes in the community were more than just policy updates. They were visible in the everyday life of the neighborhood. The morning sun still rose over the park's oak trees, but it now shone on a very different scene than it had that fateful Tuesday. Thomas sat on his usual bench, but he was no longer alone. A diverse group of morning regulars had made it their habit to gather there, sharing stories and watching the birds feast on scattered seeds. The retired nurse who had helped him that day now brought her grandchildren to hear him tell stories about civil rights history. They sat on colorful blankets spread on the grass, their young faces eager to learn. "Tell us again about the day everyone stood up together," a small boy asked, clutching his own copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, a gift from his parents after hearing about what happened in the park. Thomas smiled, noting how the story had already become part of the community's shared history. The police department had undergone significant changes. Officer Bennett's termination was just the beginning. The internal investigation had uncovered a pattern of similar incidents, leading to a complete overhaul of training procedures. Now, new officers could often be seen walking through the park, stopping to chat with residents, learning names and stories, building the trust that had been broken. The Civilian Oversight Committee, established in the wake of the incident, had become a model for other communities. Thomas had been asked to serve as one of its founding members, along with the construction worker who had spoken up that day. Together, they reviewed police conduct reports and helped shape new community-oriented policies. District Attorney Linda Thompson's morning jogs now included regular stops to check in with park visitors. She had turned the incident into a launching point for a broader community justice initiative. "What happened here showed us the power of standing together," she often said at community meetings. But more importantly, it showed us how to turn a moment of injustice into lasting change. The young mother who had organized the first community picnic had turned it into a monthly tradition. Unity in the Park Day drew hundreds of residents from all over the city. Children played together on the playground while their parents shared stories and built connections. The golden retriever that had witnessed the incident now wore a bright vest identifying him as a therapy dog, helping nervous children feel safe around police officers who participated in the community events. Local schools had incorporated the incident into their civics curriculum, using it as a real-world example of how community action and peaceful resistance could create positive change. Thomas was often invited to speak to students, his gentle voice carrying the same passion that had made him such a beloved teacher. "It's not just about what happened to me," he would tell them. "It's about what happened because of all of us. Every person who stopped, who spoke up, who recorded, who cared, they all helped write this story." The construction workers who had witnessed everything had started a lunch break watch program. During their breaks, they would sit in different parks across the city, their bright orange vests serving as beacons of safety for anyone who might need support. Other working people had joined in, creating an informal network of community guardians. The former legal secretary's detailed notes from that day had become part of a training manual for community legal rights workshops. She now led monthly sessions in the park's community center, teaching residents how to document incidents and know their rights. "Knowledge is power," she would say, "but knowledge shared is power multiplied." The park itself had been transformed. A new plaque had been installed near Thomas's bench, not to commemorate the incident, but to celebrate the community's response to it. In honor of those who stand together, it read simply, becoming a quiet reminder of the power of unity. On Tuesday mornings, Thomas still arrived early with his bag of birdseed and his well-worn book. But now, as the morning light filtered through the trees, he would often look up to see others joining him, some with their own books, others with birdseed, all with a shared understanding of what it meant to be part of a community that stood together. The birds seemed to have multiplied too, as if sensing the park's renewed spirit. Chickadees, cardinals, and sparrows gathered freely, unafraid, just as diverse as the people who now made the park their morning sanctuary. Police Chief Anderson had kept his word about changes. The department's new community engagement program had become a model for other cities. Officers now underwent extensive training that included regular community service hours and cultural awareness workshops. More importantly, they were required to build real relationships with the residents they served. As Thomas watched a new group of children scatter birdseed near his bench, he remembered something he used to tell his students. History isn't just about the past. It's about the moments we choose to stand up and change the future. Looking around at his transformed community, he knew they had done exactly that. The story of what happened that Tuesday morning was still being shared, but now it was more than just a tale of injustice confronted. It had become a testament to how a community could grow stronger through adversity, how a moment of darkness could lead to lasting light, and how the simple act of standing together could transform not just a park, but an entire community's future. The employee break room, once a place of hushed conversations and quick meals, became a space for sharing ideas and building relationships. The owner had it renovated with comfortable seating, good coffee, and walls covered with employee photos and achievements. "This is your home away from home," he told his staff. "It should feel like one." Small touches made big differences. The store's music playlist was updated to include a diverse mix of genres. Signs appeared in multiple languages. The gift wrapping service, which had been discontinued years ago, was brought back, free of charge for all customers. By the end of the first month, the change was palpable. Sales were climbing, but more importantly, the atmosphere had transformed. Customers lingered longer, smiled more, brought their friends. Employees walked with a new confidence, proud to wear their name tags, eager to help. One evening, as the sun was setting and the last customers were leaving, the owner stood at the front entrance, just watching. A young father was helping his daughter try on her first pair of dress shoes. An elderly couple was being assisted by a patient sales associate with their anniversary purchase. A group of teenagers was excitedly planning their prom outfits. In that moment, he could almost feel his grandmother standing beside him, nodding in approval. The store was becoming what it had always meant to be, not just a place to buy things, but a place where everyone's dignity was honored, where dreams were respected, where community meant something real. You see, he could almost hear her say, sometimes the best way to fix something isn't to tear it all down, but to remember what made it special in the first place. 6 months had passed since that fateful morning when the owner revealed his identity and began transforming Riverside Department Store. The change wasn't just in the numbers, though those were impressive enough. Sales had increased by 40%, employee turnover had dropped to nearly zero, and customer satisfaction scores were the highest they'd been in 20 years. The real change was in the stories that filled the store's halls every day. There was the story of the young man who had been hired as a janitor and was now training to become a department supervisor. Someone finally saw what I could do, not just what I was doing, he told a local reporter who came to write about the store's transformation. Then there was the elderly couple who returned to shop for the first time in 10 years. The wife had tears in her eyes as she told the owner, "We used to avoid this place. Now it feels like coming home." They spent an afternoon picking out matching sweaters for their grandchildren, helped by a patient sales associate who reminded the owner of his grandmother. The children's department had become a special source of joy. One Saturday, a little girl tugged on her mother's sleeve, pointing at a display. "Look, Mama, that doll looks just like me." Her mother, who had faced her own share of unwelcome experiences in stores over the years, smiled with relief and pride. The employee break room wall was now covered with photos, not just of sales achievements, but of real moments. The staff volleyball team at the community picnic, employees volunteering at local schools, celebration parties for promotions and personal milestones. It wasn't just a workplace anymore, it was a family. The owner had started a scholarship program, offering paid internships and retail management training to local students. "My grandmother always said that when you climb up, you need to send the elevator back down," he explained to his board of directors. The first class of interns was already making waves in the industry, bringing fresh ideas and energy to the retail world. Even the former manager's story had a surprising twist. After her departure, she had gone through some soul-searching. 6 months later, she sent a letter to the owner, apologizing for her actions and sharing how the experience had changed her perspective. She was now working with a non-profit organization focused on workplace equality. The security guards who had escorted the owner out that day had been offered a choice: undergo comprehensive retraining or find new positions. Most chose to stay, and now they were some of the store's biggest advocates for fair treatment. "We learned that real security comes from making people feel welcome, not watched," their team leader explained during a training session for new hires. The store's success caught the attention of other businesses in the city. The owner found himself being invited to speak at Chamber of Commerce meetings and retail conferences. But he always kept his message simple: treat people with dignity, and success will follow. One day, a young entrepreneur came to seek his advice. "How did you manage to change things without making everyone defensive?" she asked. The owner smiled, remembering his grandmother's words. "You have to lead with love," he told her. "Even when you're addressing wrongs, you have to leave room for people to become better than they were." The store's anniversary celebration became a community event. The main floor was transformed into a space for local vendors, artists, and performers. People who had never shopped together now stood side by side, sharing stories and dreams. Children played while their parents chatted, elderly couples danced to the live band, and teenagers helped organize activities for the younger kids. But perhaps the most touching moment came one quiet afternoon when the owner was walking through the formal wear department. He overheard a grandmother telling her grandson, "Stand up straight now. This is where we buy your first suit." The scene was so familiar it made his heart skip a beat. He watched as the elderly sales associate treated the young boy like a little gentleman, just as someone had done for him all those years ago. The boy stood a little taller, looked a little prouder, felt a little more special, just as every customer should. That evening, after closing, the owner sat in his office looking at an old photo of himself and his grandmother standing in front of the store. He could almost hear her voice. "See? Sometimes the hardest roads lead to the most beautiful destinations. The store had become more than just a business success story. It was proof that change was possible, that wrongs could be made right, that dignity could be restored. But most importantly, it showed that one person's courage to stand up, combined with the wisdom to lead with love, could transform not just a store, but an entire community. As he turned out the lights and walked through the quiet aisles, he smiled at the mannequins in the window, now representing every shape, size, and shade of humanity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new chances to make his grandmother proud. Because in the end, this wasn't just about running a successful store. It was about creating a place where everyone, absolutely everyone, could walk through those doors and feel like they belonged, just as his grandmother had always dreamed it could be.